Stone was meant to keep secrets. In the deep chambers where light thinned and breath slowed, walls were raised to outlast kings and silence the living. Yet something endured that stone could not bury. It moved without feet, waited without hunger, and passed intact through collapse and fire. Hands once sealed it away with ritual care, believing weight and depth would finish the task. Centuries later, other hands touched the same surfaces and felt a resistance older than language. They did not name it. They did not claim it. They carried its pressure outward, quietly, across seas and thresholds. What remained behind did not vanish. It stayed unchanged, while dynasties thinned and banners rotted. Egypt learned that concealment preserves as much as it hides. Some things, once structured into the world, continue by their own law. Stone remembers, memory settles, and not everything sealed is meant to sleep forever now. The desert was already old when the first stones were guided toward the waiting ground. Dawn had only begun its slow rise, and the light that touched the sand did so without hurry, stretching itself thin across dunes that had shifted through ages without memory of their earliest forms. The builders approached in silence, not because silence was demanded, but because the land had a habit of absorbing sound before it traveled far. Their feet pressed shallow prints into the morning crust. Behind them, the tools lay bundled, cords darkened by long use, levers polished where countless hands had steadied them, wedges carved from tamarisk wood that had learned to bend rather than splinter. Nothing here was new, yet every movement felt deliberate, as though the desert itself required a certain restraint. When the first stone reached its place, no voice marked the moment. The block was eased downward with a care that defied the harshness of its shape. Hands tightened around the ropes, bodies leaning back to steady the descent. Dust rose gently, drifting around their legs like breath freed from the earth. The stone settled with a muted sigh, its weight sinking fully into the ground. No tremor followed. The land accepted what it was given, as if it had been preparing for this arrival long before any builder had drawn breath. Another stone approached, then another. Each one was greeted as though the chamber below were already present in the minds of those who worked above it. Angles were tested with stretched cord. Edges were brushed clean by fingers that understood the language of abrasion. Surfaces were smoothed, not for the eyes of any future wanderer, but to remove anything that might disturb the stillness the chamber would one day hold. Tools tapped softly, adjusting imperfections until the stone no longer resisted its neighbors. As the wall's height deepened into the earth, the air changed. The coolness that belonged to shadow began to gather, collecting along the descending passage. Every step downward felt like stepping into another temperament of silence, one that did not mirror the hush of desert morning, but something denser, older, shaped by intention rather than emptiness. Sound no longer followed the workers. Their movements became slower, as though the space they entered demanded a different rhythm from the one they had used under open sky. Within the emerging chamber, stone met stone with a precision that suggested memory more than measurement. Lines aligned without conflict. Corners held their angles. The work did not ask for decoration. It asked only to endure. Hands brushed the inner walls until they no longer caught on grain. Dust was wiped away and left to drift downward in thin spirals. Even the smallest roughness was addressed. The chamber's task required no interruption, not even from the stone itself. Above, the sun lifted higher, brightening dunes that now hid every trace of the builder's arrival. Wind passed over footprints and began its slow erasure. Nothing on the surface recorded the work done below. The desert guarded its stillness easily. Below, the chamber gathered its own kind of stillness. The air tightened, becoming more deliberate. The temperature stayed steady. Sound shortened further, becoming something that stopped at the edges of breath. Even the workers' bodies responded to the shift. Shoulders lowered, steps softened. Voices, if they had risen, would have dissolved before reaching the ceiling. This place was never meant for wandering. It was shaped to hold. Every line, every weight, every quiet adjustment contributed to a condition designed to outlast the world that made it. The builders knew they would not walk here again. They worked with the understanding that their touch would be the last human contact for a long span of time. Their movements were not hurried. They were final. When the last stone of the inner chamber settled, the builders stepped back, giving space for the room to breathe into its new form. Dust began to drift downward once more, this time more lowly, more intentionally, as if even the air wished to take its rightful place. No doorway marked the completion. only the certainty shared between workers that the chamber was now itself, stable, aligned, and awaiting the weight of the world that would one day rest above it. The desert kept its silence, and the chamber began its long work of becoming a place where time behaved differently, where memory would not fade, and where depth itself would learn to speak in stillness. Above the buried chamber, the day unfolded with its usual indifference. Light rose, stretched, and settled across the dunes in slow currents. Shadows lengthened, then dissolved. Wind traced shallow furrows, lifted grains from one ridge, carried them to another. Nothing on the surface hinted that a new interior now held its place beneath the sand. No scar of construction lingered. The desert absorbed the disturbance, smoothing itself with the patience of something too ancient to be altered by the labor of a single moment. Below, the chamber adjusted to its own completion. The air no longer shifted in response to footsteps or voices, for none remained. Temperature settled into an equilibrium that surface dwellers would never feel, cool, patient, neither inviting nor hostile. Darkness arranged itself evenly, without corners of chaos or patches of deeper night. The walls no longer waited for touch. They released the last warmth of the builder's hands and returned to stillness. What entered now was not a person, but time. It seeped through stone in slow, unbroken lines. It did not pass in waves or cycles. It accumulated. Every grain of dust that settled upon the floor became part of a quiet ledger. Each layer added weight to the silence. Shadows no longer shifted. They simply stayed, becoming part of the chamber's architecture. The stillness here was not the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of purpose, complete, functioning, uninterrupted. Pressure from the earth above began its long descent through stone. The chamber felt it first as a faint settling, a redistribution of the weight it had been built to bear. There was no groan, no protest. What would have strained a lesser structure was absorbed evenly, the blocks adjusting to one another with the assurance of pieces carved for cooperation. The system held, not through rigidity, but through balance. Every surface touched another with intention. Every seam carried its portion of the burden. Occasionally, small sounds traveled downward, vibrations carried through deep layers of earth, softened before they reached the chamber. A distant shifting of dunes, the fall of a boulder in a far-off ravine, the tremor of hooves passing miles above. These sounds arrived faintly, like memories that no longer pressed against the present. They touched the chamber and faded without consequence. Inside, the air remained undisturbed. The dust did not rise. The darkness did not waver. This was not emptiness. It was a continuation. The chamber did not need guardians or rituals. Its discipline was embedded in its proportions. Anyone who entered, if anyone ever did, would feel the weight of that discipline before they understood it. Shoulders would lower. Steps would shorten. Voices would shrink into whispers without instruction. The chamber's authority required no explanation. It expressed itself through design alone. Above, seasons changed. Floods pressed against the riverbanks in distant places, then withdrew. Traders crossed long routes. Settlements grew and shrank. Storms reshaped the horizon. None of these movements touched the chamber. They passed across the surface like shadows sliding across stone. They were noticed only by the wind. Below, the chamber's world remained constant. The air did not shift with the seasons. The walls did not echo the tempests outside. The earth pressed downward with predictable steadiness. The stone accepted every change without altering its task. Occasionally, the slightest adjustment occurred deep within the chamber walls, a faint settling, a shifting within a seam. These movements were not signs of weakness. They were confirmations of endurance. Stone does not remain still by resisting pressure. It remains still by understanding how to receive it. The builders had known this. Their work had not aimed at beauty or grandeur. It had aimed at permanence through equilibrium. The chamber did not enforce stillness. It encouraged it. Even the dust obeyed, lying in faint, undisturbed patterns that recorded nothing but the ongoing passage of time. The desert above moved. The chamber below continued. And in that quiet separation, the system proved itself again and again, not through action, but through the unwavering fulfillment of its purpose. Days folded into one another above the buried chamber, unnoticed by anything beneath. Winds altered their paths. New sands drifted in from distant plains, layering themselves over older dunes, shifting the contours of the land in slow, unhurried breaths. Herds crossed the horizon at times, leaving tracks that vanished before nightfall. Fires burned in scattered encampments, then dimmed. Voices rose and disappeared into the open air. The surface continued its long dialogue with time, unbroken and unconcerned. Below, the chamber did not participate in these cycles. It received only pressure, only silence, only the dense continuity of earth settling more firmly with every passing season. The stone held without desire, without resistance. Its stillness deepened, not as a response to the world above, but as a natural expansion of the conditions carved into it. The chamber became what it had been shaped to be, a place where nothing intruded, nothing demanded, nothing changed, except through the slow, invisible conversation between weight and endurance. Within these walls, darkness had texture. It gathered in soft layers, settling against stone like smoke slowed into permanence. Shadows did not move, they mingled. They became indistinguishable from the air itself. Dust rested in faint patterns on the floor, never disturbed, never rearranged by breath or motion. Even the smallest grain seemed to understand that it belonged to a larger stillness. The chamber held these tiny records without meaning to record anything. It was simply the nature of its quiet. The stone itself carried the memory of hands that had shaped it. The pressure of smoothing palms, the careful correction of edges, the silent testing of seams, these impressions did not fade. They remained as the last echoes of human touch, though no warmth remained from the bodies that had labored here. What endured was intention, a firmness in the way blocks met each other, a certainty in their alignment. The chamber possessed this certainty now as its own. Above, storms rumbled on distant horizons, vibrating faintly through layers of sand and rock. These tremors softened as they descended and arrived in the chamber as murmurs barely distinguishable from silence. The stone received them as it had received everything else, evenly, without agitation. For a moment, the dust may have shifted, only slightly, only a fraction of a breath's worth of movement, before returning to stillness. Even disruption folded itself into calm. Generations passed on the surface. Boundaries of kingdoms shifted, leaders rose, ruled and vanished, roads appeared where none had been before. Travelers crossed the desert with goods and stories, some perished, some returned. Fires were built and children were born and old voices faded into the wind. Nothing of this reached the chamber. The world moved, but movement was an agreement between the living and the open sky. The chamber belonged to the depth, where agreements were different. Inside, the air remained exactly as it had been after sealing. It did not grow stale, for it did not circulate. It did not warm or cool in response to any season. It existed in a state that needed no renewal. A slight weight pressed into it from the surrounding stone, creating a density that encouraged quiet. Anyone who might have entered, though none did, would have felt their chest tighten, not from discomfort, but from reverence. The body would have understood the space long before the mind did. The floor held its unbroken dust. The walls continued to bear their pressure. The ceiling, constructed with meticulous balance, resisted collapse not through force, but through harmony. Every stone strengthened every other stone. The chamber persisted not as a relic, but as a system, one that deepened in function as time pressed harder against it. Above, dunes shifted. Below, nothing shifted unless it needed to. The chamber remained intact through all seasons, all storms, all forgotten histories. Its endurance was neither triumph nor defiance. It was simply the fulfillment of its design. And so it waited, not for discovery, not for purpose to be renewed, but because waiting had been woven into its foundation. The world above changed its face many times. The chamber did not. Here, beneath layers of sand, brought from places no builder had ever seen, the quiet continued its uninterrupted descent into permanence. Before the chamber accepted its long silence, the world around it moved with measured intent. The desert morning held its breath as figures approached the threshold carved at the mouth of the descent. Their feet, bare against stone cooled by night, pressed soundlessly along the narrow passage. Every step followed another in a cadence old enough that no voice needed to speak it. The order of movement was not taught, it was inherited, carried in posture and breath rather than memory spoken aloud. The first to enter bore nothing in their hands. They carried only presence, allowing the chamber to feel the weight of those who would prepare its interior. Their silhouettes passed through the early light, then dissolved into the dimness below. Behind them came others, each one bearing an object wrapped in darkened cloth or left uncovered, so its form could breathe in the enclosed air. These objects did not jostle. They did not sway. Arms held them in a manner that suggested not fragility, but significance, each item meant to rest in a place chosen before any builder shaped the chamber's stone. As they descended deeper, the temperature shifted. Warmth from the surface faded into a cool restraint. Light thinned into muted bands, touching the stone without illuminating it. The air pressed gently inward, reminding every breath that this space accepted only what remained steady. Those who carried the unwrapped objects slowed their breathing, matching the chamber's own settling quiet. Nothing entering this place was allowed to stir wind or hurry. The procession reached the floor, where the faintest dust had gathered since the last builders departed. The dust did not rise when feet touched it. It settled further, as though understanding that this moment signaled the final shaping of the chamber's purpose. The bearers stepped into a wide circle and paused, forming a ring that echoed the chamber's proportions. No instruction was spoken, yet every movement followed an order older than the walls around them. One by one, the objects were placed. Some rested against the smooth stone, fitting themselves into alcoves shaped during construction. Others stood alone, occupying spaces defined by absence rather than form. Wrappings were unbound with deliberate slowness. Cloth folded inward, creating soft pools at the feet of each object, then was gathered again into the arms of those who carried it away. Exposed surfaces met the cool air without resistance. Wood, stone, metal, and woven fibers each responded differently, yet all carried a shared stillness once set down. A calm line moved through the chamber, grounding the moment without breaking the quiet. Hands lifted, adjusted, and withdrew. Each withdrawal was mirrored by another, forming a sequence that traveled around the circle until every placement reached its precise balance. The chamber absorbed the arrangement. No item wobbled or pressed against its neighbors. The work did not require correction. Once the placements were complete, the order of movement reversed. Those closest to the center stepped back first. Those near the walls followed next. The pattern unfolded like a tide, withdrawing without haste. Dust settled again, responding to the shift in weight rather than the shift in motion. At the entrance to the narrowing passage, the final bearer turned briefly, not to review the work, but to acknowledge the chamber's new condition. Nothing remained undone. Nothing waited for reconsideration. The system required completion, and completion had now been reached. As they ascended, the floor began to cool further, accepting the absence of human presence. The objects did not shift. They did not echo the footsteps that departed. They simply rested where they had been placed, as if they had grown from the stone instead of being carried into it. At the top of the passage, hands approached the great door with a reverence that did not slow their movements. Stone met stone as the slab was guided back into its frame. The sound it made was gentle, deliberate, nearly lost in the desert wind that brushed the threshold. The closing did not announce finality. It allowed the chamber to enter its next state. Outside, the desert began its work again. Wind lifted grains of sand and scattered them along the entrance, softening the lines carved by tools. Shadows of the departing figures lengthened, merged with the dunes, then vanished into open brightness. The land offered no trace of what had been carried below. Inside, the chamber accepted its burden fully. The air settled. The temperature is steady. The objects, though motionless, did not enter emptiness. They entered a function, one that would continue long after the memory of hands had faded from the surface world. Something waited there now, not in anticipation, but on purpose. When the last echo of footsteps dissolved into the narrowing passage, the chamber shifted into a different order of stillness. It did not change shape. It did not deepen or expand. Yet something within it settled, as though the space acknowledged that motion had ended and permanence had begun. The air held itself close, unmoving except for the slow balancing of temperature against stone. Nothing in the chamber leaned or strained. Each object rested according to a plan older than its materials. The floor, touched only moments before by bare feet, cooled into quiet. Dust lowered itself in faint spirals, forming thin layers that accepted the chamber's new occupants without resistance. Shadows wrapped around the arranged objects, softening edges, making them part of the darkness rather than standing apart from it. Light no longer descended from above. Only memory of light remained, held faintly in the surfaces smoothed by long labor. Within this sealed space, time did not flow forward in the way the surface world measured it. It gathered instead. It settled in the silence like a mineral forming slowly in water. The objects, though fixed in place, were not inert. Their presence altered the chamber's equilibrium. Wood absorbed the coolness differently than stone. Metal adjusted to the air with a faint tightening. Woven fibers released the last traces of warmth held from the journey downward. These changes were subtle, but the chamber felt them, not through motion, but through shifting weight and balance. A grounding line moved through the space, a quiet acknowledgement of the chamber's fully realized state. Nothing hastened, nothing resisted. The system accepted its contents as naturally as sand accepts a falling grain. Outside, the desert resumed its work of erasure. Wind gathered threads of sand and carried them toward the sealed entrance, letting them fall where stone met earth. Sunlight hardened the surface, then softened it again by evening. The chamber received none of this. It remained separated by depth and darkness, untouched by the shifting world above. Inside, the objects settled further into their positions, not visibly, not through movement, but through a deeper union with the environment surrounding them. Each one had a role determined long before arrival. The chamber understood this without a single marking or line of instruction. It offered no guidance. It simply created the conditions under which the purpose of every object could be fulfilled. Moisture balanced itself within the enclosed air. Temperatures stabilized into a range neither warm nor cold, but constant. No draft disturbed the placement of cloth or the angle of stone. The silence grew denser, not as absence but as fulfillment. Breath, if it had remained, would have slowed in response. The chamber's shape encouraged calm, the kind of calm that weighed upon the body and guided it towards stillness. Far above, the desert moved through the day. Heat pressed down, wind carved new lines across old dunes. Animals crossed the sands in quiet procession. None of their steps, none of their passing weight reached the chamber. The depth muted every trace. Within the sealed interior, time continued layering itself along the walls and objects. Fine patterns began to form in the dust at the base of each piece. Not designs, not symbols, simply the natural settling of the world in a place that refused to be disturbed. These faint marks would not be noticed by any human eye for many seasons, perhaps many generations. Yet they accumulated steadily, each grain falling according to laws older than the chamber itself. Occasionally, a distant tremor traveled downward, the sound of shifting dunes or the settling of a far-off ridge. The chamber received these murmurs with indifference. Stone absorbed them evenly, distributing pressure across every seam. What might have unsettled lesser spaces left this one unchanged. The chamber did not respond, it adjusted, which is not the same. Adjustment was its strength, endurance was its purpose. The objects did not awaken, they did not transform, they simply waited, held in place by design rather than hope. Motion had brought them here, stillness would hold them. Systems that begin in movement do not die when movement ends. They shift into another phase, one governed by time rather than hands. The desert above erased every sign that anything had happened at all. Wind smoothed the last of the surface marks. Sunlight dried the remaining shadows. Night reclaimed the dunes. Nothing spoke of the descent below. But inside, something remained that did not change with the seasons. Something held its place with quiet certainty. The chamber had closed, but the purpose within it had only begun. Night settled above the sealed chamber with its usual quiet, spreading coolness across the dunes until the sand lost all memory of the day's heat. Stars moved in slow procession, unseen by anything below. The desert breathed in long, patient intervals, its winds lifting grains of sand and laying them down again in patterns that shifted without intention. No trace of the earlier procession remained. The desert had reclaimed the surface with a completeness only time could provide. Below, the chamber continued its transition from a place shaped by hands to a world governed entirely by depth. The last warmth brought inside by the procession faded from the stone, absorbed without leaving a mark. Darkness grew heavier, settling into every angle and surface until it no longer felt like an absence of light, but a presence in its own right, a soft, enveloping calm that made the chamber feel finished, not abandoned. The objects placed earlier now belonged fully to the space around them. Their outlines softened in the low darkness. Edges that once caught faint glimmers of descending light now merged with shadow. Nothing moved, nothing needed adjustment. The chamber had no need for watchers or caretakers, its constant action ensured that purpose would continue without guidance. The air held steady, maintaining a perfect balance between dryness and density. Each object resonated with that equilibrium in its own way, stone settling deeper into silence, metal cooling into stillness, wood accepting the chamber's temperature like a long breath released. A calm grounding line spread through the chamber, the simple, unbroken truth that nothing here required intervention. The system was complete. Above, a distant gust pressed against the dunes, sending vibrations down through layers of earth and sand. These tremors arrived as faint murmurs, barely strong enough to brush the chamber's outer walls. The stone accepted the pressure with the same quiet strength it offered to all things. The weight from above did not threaten. It completed the system, pushing downward in slow increments that reinforced the chamber's enduring shape. Time began to collect more noticeably now, not through change, but through accumulation. Dust continued to settle, forming almost invisible ridges around the bases of the arranged objects. The patterns grew in such fine increments that even the chamber itself seemed to pause between each new grain. This was time measured in silence, not seasons. In the far corner, where the smoothing hands of the builders had created a near-seamless rise in the stone, the darkness thickened. No light would ever reach that place. It became the chamber's deepest stillness, a point where even the faint memory of breath could not linger. The objects closest to this depth seemed to lean into the silence, not physically, but in the way presence interacts with space. Each item accepted its role without question, as though the stone had whispered its purpose long before the procession carried it down. Above, the desert shifted again. A new crescent of sand formed along a ridge, reshaped by the ongoing dialogue of wind and time. Nothing living paused to wonder what lay below. Travelers crossed without notice. Their steps pressed briefly into the earth before disappearing into the shifting grains. Inside, the chamber remained unbroken. Its walls held steady, its corners supported each other, its ceiling resisted the slow pressure of the world above. Every part of the structure contributed to a harmony that deepened as the interior continued its quiet work. The objects did not age in the way the surface expected them to. Some materials stiffened, some hardened, some released lingering traces of their origins, but none decayed. Decay required intrusion, motion, or imbalance, conditions the chamber did not permit. The stillness here was not passive, it was active cohesion, a system functioning exactly as intended. Motion had delivered the objects to this place. Stillness now held them in a phase of preservation that no force on the surface could interrupt. Even time itself moved differently within these boundaries. It pressed inward without dispersing. It accumulated without eroding. When dawn returned to the desert, the chamber felt nothing of it. Light did not seep through, warmth did not descend. The only sign of a new day was the faint shift in pressure above as heat expanded the sand. The chamber accepted this too, folding the change into its quiet constancy. Everything brought into the space remained exactly where hands had placed it. Nothing stirred, nothing stretched, nothing called for movement. The door, sealed with deliberate intention, did not tremble or remind the chamber of the world beyond it. Systems born in motion had entered their phase of stillness. And within that stillness, something continued, not growing, not sleeping, but waiting in the way stone itself waits, without haste, without expectation, without end. Long before anyone spoke of chambers or sanctuaries, the discipline that shaped them was already moving through stone. It existed first as intention, carried in the posture of builders, in the distance between footsteps, in the pauses taken before a tool touched the surface. When walls began to rise, they did so under a logic that did not need to be written. Corridors were drawn not as routes, but as corrections, guiding the body toward a quieter manner of being. Angles sharpened where thought needed narrowing. Spaces widened where breath required release. The architecture did not request order, It imposed it through the natural persuasion of structure. Those who entered the first completed passages felt this before they understood it. The narrowing of a corridor pressed shoulders inward. The height of the ceiling softened the voice. The long stretch of polished stone beneath their feet slowed the rhythm of walking. Nothing here was ornament. Every line had been carved to instruct. Every void had its task. Even the air seemed to know where it belonged, settling more heavily in places where focus was required, lifting slightly where burden eased. Symbols carved into the walls did not depict creatures or stories. I carried a discipline older than imagery, a language meant not to be interpreted but absorbed. Their presence guided movement the way currents guide a river's course, subtle, steady, unavoidable. A hand brushed against a marking and instinctively drew back, not from fear but from recognition. The stone spoke not through sound but through form. Light behaved differently in these spaces. It traveled along defined paths, slipping down narrow throws where walls pulled it into thin strips, or widening into soft fields where chambers opened gently. The play of brightness and shadow did not decorate, it instructed. A traveler moving through such a place learned to follow the shift of illumination, stepping where the light thinned, slowing where it deepened. Vision became discipline. Sight became obedience. A calm grounding moved along the corridors, anchored in the stone's steady patience. The structure did not rush those who walked within it. It simply shaped them, quietly, without announcing its purpose. Over time, the discipline that lived inside the stone began to replicate beyond its first confines. New chambers rose in distant places, echoing the proportions and angles of their predecessors. Builders who had learned the system carried its methods within their bodies. They needed no scrolls, no diagrams. Their hands remembered. Their breath remembered. The weight they placed upon each stone was remembered. Thus the architecture spread without losing its nature. The corridors of new sites narrowed in the same places. The voids opened with the same intention. Symbols reappeared in the same measured intervals, guiding movement with familiarity even to those who had never seen the original structures. Stone taught method. The method taught continuity. And continuity did not depend on names or rulers. It depended on obedience to principles carved long before any traveler entered space. Caretakers changed over the generations. Some understood the purpose of the structures, others did not. It made no difference. The architecture did not rely on belief. It relied on form. When a person walked through these corridors, their pace changed whether they intended it or not. Their voices softened whether they understood the reason or not. Their posture aligned with the discipline carved around them. The structure trained the body the way a river smooths stone, through contact, not instruction. This was how knowledge survived without explanation. It embedded itself into space. A traveler could enter without knowing a single story, a single origin, a single rule, yet emerge changed in a way they could not clearly name. They would walk differently. Their breathing would alter. Their silence would deepen. The structure had completed its task. Later generations inherited the architecture without inheriting the ritual. They entered the spaces without the old understanding. Yet the forms continued to function. A corridor that narrowed still drew the body inward. A chamber that opened still invited breath to expand. Symbols whose meanings had faded still imposed order through their repetition and placement. The architecture held its discipline even when memory did not. Design, once set, does not argue. It does not plead. It simply waits for those who enter to meet it on its terms. As generations passed, those who moved through the structures no longer remembered who had drawn the first corridors or why the angles held such precision. Yet the architecture continued its quiet instruction. A traveler stepping into a long, narrowing hall would feel their pace adjust before their mind caught up. Their footsteps shortened, their breath steadied, their thoughts gathered themselves into a single line, pulled inward by the discipline the walls enforced. No voice explained this. No guardian gestured. The stone itself shaped the moment. Light entered the upper passageways at slanted intervals, thinning into soft chains that fell across the floors. Anyone walking through them instinctively lowered their gaze, not out of reverence, but because the light arranged itself in a way that quieted movement. Shadow followed each beam, creating a rhythm of guidance that required no interpretation. Where brightness faded, sound softened. When the shadow deepened, the body slowed. The structure spoke through contrast, its language carried by illumination rather than words. Deeper inside, voids opened unexpectedly, measured spaces that released the tension built in the corridors. Here, voices, if they rose at all, dissolved immediately against the wide stone surfaces. Such voids taught stillness not through confinement, but through release. Shoulders relaxed, breathing deepened. The weight of the previous passage fell away. This alternation, narrowing and release, pressure and rest, became the unspoken rhythm of the architecture. The body learned it as naturally as water learns its path, through riverbeds carved long before the first current flowed. Symbols. Those quiet markings that were not decoration lined certain walls with steady repetition. Their shapes remained simple, deliberate, never calling attention to themselves, yet they carried a weight felt more in the bones than the eyes. Travelers traced the edge of a marking without knowing why, sensing that this place required a different kind of awareness. The symbols directed posture, attention, even silence, without offering a single explanation. They did not teach through meaning, they taught through presence. A calm grounding line extended through the heart of these designs, steady as the foundation beneath the stone. It was the simple truth that the structure trained those who entered it, whether they wished to be trained or not. Over time, the system traveled farther than those who built it. Builders who had once served as apprentices carried the proportions of the chambers in their memory. When they shaped new spaces, they replicated the angles, the lengths, the voids, even when they did not replicate the purpose. The architecture's discipline had imprinted itself into their bodies. Once learned, it could not be unlearned. Thus new structures rose in distant lands, echoing the silent laws of the first. Corridors narrowed at familiar points. Doorways were placed with the same restraint. Courtyards opened with the same sense of release. No two sites were identical, yet all belonged to the same lineage. The discipline was transferable, carried not by texts or rituals, but by the unspoken knowledge of those who shaped stone. Even when caretakers changed entirely, when names shifted and memory dissolved, the structures retained their authority. A new generation might enter without context, believing themselves first to see the hallways, first to feel the depth of the voids. Yet the architecture responded to them in the same way it had to those who built it. Shoulders lowered, steps softened, conversations quieted into murmurs. The system functioned without instruction. Some rooms became places where no one dared speak loudly, though no law forbade it. Some corridors drew travelers into silence without intention. Some chambers created a stillness that lingered in the mind long after one stepped back into sunlight. None of these effects required understanding. They were outcomes of design that remained loyal to its origins even when its origins were forgotten. In time, the meaning behind the symbols faded, but not their influence. The purpose of the voids was lost, but not their effect. The narrowing of corridors continued to shape posture. The widening of chambers continued to allow release. Knowledge survived by becoming inseparable from the environment itself. The architecture never demanded belief. It never asked anyone to trust it. It simply held its form, certain that those who entered would conform to the discipline carved into its walls. And as long as stone endured, the discipline endured with it, waiting, shaping, continuing. As seasons shifted above and names of rulers changed, the discipline carved into the architecture did not waver. Stones that had once been shaped under the direction of ancient hands continued their quiet labor, training each traveler who passed through without ever revealing their purpose. The corridors remained constant, their narrowing and widening untouched by time. Even when weathered surfaces softened or markings faded, the underlying intention held firm. Form guided behavior, and behavior reinforced the memory of form. Those who entered these places found themselves adjusting unconsciously. A heavy footstep lightened, a hurried breath slowed. The simple act of walking through the passageways became a kind of alignment, one that required no doctrine, only presence. Voices diminished naturally, echoing less with each step until they folded into stillness. Travelers who had never met each other moved with the same restraint, shaped by a discipline they did not know they were obeying. The space did not request silence, it created it. Light shifted throughout the day, tracing thin shapes along the walls. The architecture welcomed these slivers, allowing them to slip across markings and corners in a measured progression. These slow movements created a rhythm separate from the world outside. Where the desert sun hurried from one horizon to the other, the chamber slowed its light into patient gestures. Even a single beam filtering through a narrow cut carried the same calm authority as a guiding hand. Its presence revealed surfaces that seemed carved not for visibility, but for reflection of purpose. As the beam shifted, the walls responded with steadiness, offering no surprise, only continuity. Deeper inside, the voids retained their sense of release, wide spaces where burdens softened, where the body recognized itself again after the long discipline of the corridors. These voids did not offer escape, they offered equilibrium. A traveler entering such a chamber felt the enduring pressure of the narrow passage fall away, replaced by an expansive quiet that seemed to hold the breath of ages. The walls stood at generous distances, yet the stillness was no weaker here. It expanded rather than diminished, creating a fullness of silence instead of an emptiness of it. A calm grounding line settled over the entire structure, an unspoken reminder that everything within these walls had been shaped to participate in a larger order. Movement, breath, posture, silence, all answered to the same logic. As time passed, the architecture continued teaching. It trained those who tended it, even when they believed themselves its masters. Caretakers learned to speak softly not because of instruction, but because the stone made louder tones feel misplaced. They walked with gentler steps, because heavy ones disrupted the balance of the corridors. They touched the markings with care, not understanding their meaning, but sensing their authority. The structure shaped its keepers so thoroughly that even outside its boundaries, they carried its discipline in their manner. They stood straighter, they spoke with measured calm, they held silence with ease. When new structures were erected in distant lands, their builders brought these learned movements with them. They carved corridors with familiar narrowing. They positioned openings to catch light in the same deliberate patterns. They shaped voids to hold the release of breath. They marked walls with symbols whose meanings they no longer knew, yet whose presence felt necessary. Thus, without intention, the discipline continued. Architecture became language. Language became memory. Even when centuries passed and the origins faded entirely, the structures remained loyal to their design. A traveler entering one of these places long after its creators' names had vanished still felt the same shift, body adjusting, silence forming, breath easing into the pattern carved around it. The architecture never depended on comprehension. It needed only form. And form, once shaped with intention, does not surrender its purpose to time. It holds, it trains, it waits. The discipline carved into stone endured not because anyone preserved it, but because the spaces themselves enforced it. They continued shaping all who entered, long after the meaning behind them had turned to dust. Even as civilizations rose and receded, the architecture kept working, quietly, patiently, without argument. Design remained, memory remained within design. And those who passed through, no matter their era, no matter their belief, left changed by something they could not name, but could not ignore. The river had shaped the first stones, cooling them, softening their dust, guiding the hands that learned discipline from its patient flow. Yet once the structures beside it reached completion, the knowledge embedded in their walls did not remain confined to its banks. Those who had walked the original corridors, who had felt their shoulders narrow and their steps slow beneath carved intention, carried the discipline with them as naturally as they carried their own breath. It did not travel as a tale shared around fires, nor as an instruction etched into clay. It traveled through posture, through habit, through the quiet certainty with which builders approached new ground. When the first ports rose along the river's curve, their foundations revealed the lineage of the chambers. Blocks were arranged with the same balanced restraint. Warehouses took shape with proportions that echoed the stillness of the deep interiors, their corners set with precision that did not waver under commerce or weather. The floors were leveled with a care normally reserved for ritual sites, though the workers no longer spoke of ritual. They did not need to. Their bodies remembered what the mind had ceased to name. Ships arrived from distant regions, tying their ropes to posts driven into stone that had been measured with the same discipline as the desert chambers. Sailors who stepped onto these docks found themselves adjusting their movements without knowing why. The symmetry of the port calmed the haste of trade. Voices quieted near the storage houses where the arrangement of space encouraged stillness rather than bustle. Orientation mattered. Depth mattered. Even in structures filled with goods, the logic of the chambers endured. A calm grounding line spread through these new places, silent, steady, unnoticed by those who depended upon it every day. As caravans moved inland from the river's edge, the discipline traveled with them. Traders who had loaded their wagons in precise patterns carried that same precision to distant settlements. When they built new storage rooms, they shaped them narrower than custom demanded. They placed doorways to catch light in a certain way, allowing shadows to soften the threshold. They sealed doors not in haste, but with the deliberate pressure of palms recognizing the importance of closure. Ni spoke of the old chambers, few still knew of them, yet the design persisted. On the coast, where the river emptied into the wide horizon, new harbors emerged. Waves struck stone walls shaped according to proportions that belonged not to the sea, but to the silent interiors far inland. Builders traced shallow markings into the rock, symbols whose meanings they had forgotten, yet whose placement felt necessary. Ships unloading their cargo fell into a rhythm the architecture imposed. Heavy crates were carried along corridors intentionally narrow, guiding the body into organized lines. Even the sea, with all its unpredictability, could not disrupt the order carved into the harbor's stone. The river continued its cycles, flooding, receding, carving new paths, yet the structures influenced by the chambers reached far beyond its waters. Along old trade routes, way stations rose in measured succession. Travelers resting in these stations felt the familiar quiet that settled in hallways shaped according to the original discipline, though none could trace its origin. Storage pits were sealed with a single, balanced stone. Wells were constructed with an attention to alignment that kept their interiors cool through all seasons. Some believed this was practicality, others believed it was tradition, but neither spoke the truth. The architecture was remembered even when the people did not. Over time, the origin blurred, names changed, empires rose and fell. The chambers by the river grew older, half-buried by shifting sands, their entrances concealed, their purpose forgotten. Yet far from their silence, in bustling markets, in quiet ports, in mountain villages and desert trade points, echoes of the first discipline appeared in structures built centuries apart. Pattern without story, order without explanation. The reach of the system expanded without ambition. It did not require authority to guide it. It traveled through usefulness, through the endurance of its results. A storage house built with chamber logic preserved grain longer. A port shaped with deliberate orientation resisted storms more effectively. A sealed space remained cool even in the heat of summer. Function proved itself again and again until the architecture of discipline became a natural part of distant landscapes. Expansion did not dilute the system. I tested it, and the system held. Structures that had never seen the river behaved as though the river had shaped them. And in this quiet replication, the discipline achieved what the builders had not planned but had made inevitable, a reach that moved beyond memory, beyond names, beyond place, carried only by the stone's enduring ability to remember what people had long forgotten. As generations crossed the river's edge and moved into lands untouched by its waters, the discipline embedded in their movements continued to unfold across new horizons. Traders who built their homes in distant valleys shaped their thresholds with the same quiet logic they had once followed at the river ports. Narrow entries focused attention, wider inner rooms offered release. A visitor stepping into such a home felt the shift instantly, though no builder spoke of its origin. The architecture carried its own authority, recognized not by lineage, but by the body's response to it. Markets rose where caravan routes intersected, and even there, amid noise, barter, and urgency, the old system persisted. Stalls were arranged in measured rows. Aisles formed naturally, their width echoing the calming balance of the inland corridors. Goods were placed in deliberate order, not as display but as preservation. Baskets sat in shaded recesses, sealed jars found corners where heat could not gather. Traders who had never touched the river's banks nonetheless practiced the discipline it had birthed. They had inherited the system without knowing it. Farther still, beyond the familiar routes, outposts emerged along the edges of forests and foothills. Builders here shaped watchtowers with foundations aligned to the same principles that once governed deep chambers beneath the desert sands. The windows of these towers framed the horizon not as decoration, but as calibration, offering narrow slits where focus was needed, and wider openings where the land required broader attention. Guards stationed within the towers found themselves adjusting their posture, quieting their breath, narrowing their thoughts. The stone guided them, just as it always had. A calm grounding line flowed through these remote structures, reminding them of their distant ancestry, though none could name it. Along coastal regions, where salt winds shaped the faces of cliffs, storage buildings clung to rock with the same internal geometry as the river warehouses. Their proportions resisted moisture, managed heat, and held darkness with the same intentional quiet that had once filled the earliest chambers. Even fishermen, who worked under open sky and relied on the sea's temperament morti. Han architectural instruction followed patterns shaped by the old discipline. They stored nets in low, narrow rooms. They sealed doors with a care that echoed ancient rituals, though the rituals themselves had vanished. In mountainous regions, travelers built rest shelters for caravans. These shelters bore the unmistakable signs of the system: straight lines guiding the eye, measured voids offering relief from long roads, and storage pits shaped with the same depth-centered logic that preserved grain in the river's earliest settlements. Even the slope of the roofs carried the memory of alignment, angled in ways that balanced weight and shed water with efficient quiet. Yet the people who built these places had no story connecting them to the river. They knew only that such structures worked, that goods spoiled less quickly, that silence settled more easily, that movement inside felt disciplined without force. Function replaced lineage, use replaced memory. As centuries continued to turn, the old discipline no longer resembled a single tradition. It had fractured into countless forms, each one adapting to its surrounding landscape while retaining the unmistakable skeleton of its origin. A chamber in the mountains looked different from a storeroom by the sea, yet a traveler entering either would experience the same narrowing of thought, the same quieting of breath, the same sense of being held within a design greater than the sum of its stones. Even places untouched by human intention began to reflect the discipline. Caves chosen for refuge were arranged internally by those who sought shelter, their sleeping areas pushed into deeper pockets of darkness, their fires set near natural openings that allowed heat to escape without disturbing the calm center. The logic of arrangement persisted even in improvisation. The origin blurred to nothing. No elder recalled the first chambers. No map traced the reach of their influence. The river continued its cycles, leaving flood marks on its banks, carrying silt to distant plains, whispering its old rhythms against the land. But the structures shaped by its earliest disciplines now stretched far beyond its hearing. The system endured not because it was remembered, but because it had proven itself. It is preserved, it stabilized, it calmed, it worked. Stone remembered even when the mind did not. And so the discipline lived on, quietly, faithfully, woven into the bones of distant places, carried farther with every generation that was built not by story, but by instinct shaped long ago beside a river whose waters no longer reached them. As the reach of the system extended into lands that had never heard the river's name, the discipline reshaped itself with the landscapes it met. Forest settlements, shaded by canopies that diffused all sound into softness, adopted the same architectural restraint once forged beneath desert heat. Builders placed support beams with deliberate spacing, creating interior passages that narrowed just enough to influence the rhythm of walking. The silence of the forest blended seamlessly with the silence engineered into the structures, making it impossible to tell where natural stillness ended and learned stillness began. Travelers entering these wooden chambers noticed the familiar sensation of being guided, not through spoken instruction, but through the weight and proportion of the space itself. Shadows collected in predictable ways, corners softened under filtered light. The air settled into calm pockets, shaped not by walls alone, but by the discipline carried through memory that was no longer named. Far to the north, where cold winds pressed against thick stone walls, the same quiet system reappeared. Storage keeps in frost-bound villages mimicked the depth of the ancient river warehouses. Their entrances sat low, forcing shoulders to align and breaths to steady. Inside, warmth was preserved through the same logic of sealing that had once protected grain near the water's edge. Even in places where survival demanded urgency, The architecture encouraged measured movement. No one rushed inside these spaces. The stone did not permit it. A calm grounding line spread through these far-flung structures, uniting them in purpose, though they shared no common story. In lush plains, where fields stretched wide beneath the open sky, communities built granaries that seemed, at first glance, simple in design. Yet their foundations held the unmistakable echoes of the old discipline. Depth was respected. Airflow followed narrow, controlled paths. Shadows cooled interior chambers long into the afternoon. Farmers who had never seen the old river sites sealed their stores with the same careful pressure once used in the earliest chambers. They worked by instinct shaped across generations, unaware that each gesture carried a lineage carved originally into stone. Caravans crossing the deserts between these settlements recognized familiar rhythms without understanding the source. A rest shelter in one oasis resembled, in proportion and atmosphere, a warehouse near the coast and a tower in the mountains. Travelers felt steadied upon entering these spaces, their thoughts narrowing into order, even the animals quieted. This consistency, stretching across landscapes, spoke of a system not taught, yet universally obeyed. And then, in coastal regions, where tides reshaped the shoreline each season, the discipline found new expression. Fisher communities built curing rooms whose walls resisted moisture by echoing the earlier chamber geometry. Boathouses followed the same alignment principles that once guided desert corridors. Nets hung from beams arranged with the same internal rhythm that once governed light in subterranean spaces. Even here, where life revolved around the sea's unpredictability, the architecture insisted on calm. Across continents, the system adapted without losing itself. Builders adjusted materials, but not proportions. They altered entrances to suit weather, but not orientation. They changed symbols into new shapes, but the spacing between them remained familiar. The architecture's essence endured, often unnoticed, yet always present. As more generations passed, the origin dissolved completely. The river became a distant reference even to those who lived near its banks. Its cycles continued, flooding, retreating, cutting new lines into the land. But the discipline it had once nurtured now lived independently, embedded in homes, in markets, in fortresses, in traveling shelters, in storage pits dug into distant soil. The system did not lose strength as it dispersed. Instead, it grew more certain. Each new place tested it under different pressures: cold, heat, moisture, mountain wind, coastal storms, and the system endured them all. It adapted not in principle but in material and scale. A stone corridor near the river might become a wooden passage in the forest or a clay-lined granary in the plains, yet the effect was always the same. Movement slowed, breath steadied, the order arranged itself through form. What had begun beside a single river now shaped the behavior of people who had never seen its waters. They walked differently, they were built differently, they spoke inside certain structures with the same restraint once demanded by the deep chambers. The river had ceased to be the center of the discipline's reach. It had become only the first witness. And far beyond its listening, the architecture continued to teach, not through instruction, not through inheritance, but through the enduring certainty of design that waited quietly in every place it touched. Deep beneath the shifting sands, past the corridors where discipline trained breath and posture, there lay a chamber unlike the others. It was not wider nor more ornate. Its authority did not rise from scale or ornamentation. Its power came from calibration, an exactness of depth, pressure, and silence that no surface world could imitate. Everything placed here belonged to a condition, not a collection. The chamber was a system, not a room. Those who shaped it had understood this, though none left words to explain it. They trusted stone to hold what language could not. The descent into this place altered the body before the chamber came into view. Air thickened in measured increments. The temperature steadied into a coolness that did not fluctuate with the seasons. Light retreated until only the memory of it clung to the upper stones. Each step downward removed the intruder from the world of change and delivered them into a realm where motion held no authority. The deeper one walked, the more time seemed to slow around the bones. When the chamber's threshold was finally reached, the stone shifted its presence, not physically, not with sound, but the air pressed in with a kind of recognition, as if it had been waiting for movement to disturb its long equilibrium. The space accepted the intrusion, but did not yield to it. The objects placed here generations before remained exactly where they had been set. Their stillness carried the weight of centuries, not through decay or transformation, but through preservation so complete that even aging hesitated to find a foothold. The chamber did not present these objects, it held them. Deep pressure from the overlying stone compressed the interior into a stable quiet, the kind that resisted all forms of disturbance. The walls had been shaped with angles that supported one another in perfect balance. No single block carried the burden alone. The chamber's strength was distributed through a network of intention, each stone lending its weight to the others. Nothing here was accidental. A calm grounding line drifted through the cool interior, the realization that this space existed not to hide, but to preserve. Egypt had not concealed through forgetfulness or failure. Concealment was woven into the system's function, but destruction never had been. What entered this chamber? Entered into continuity, not disappearance. The builders had known that sealing something away did not erase it, it protected it. The deeper the burial, the stronger the preservation. Isolation acted as an active force. With no light, no air currents, no shifting temperatures, the chamber maintained a condition that belonged to neither life nor death. Time itself behaved differently here. It did not erode, it settled as dust settled slowly, invisibly, without altering the shapes it covered. The core system was not a set of structures, it was an environment engineered to resist change. When generations later, new hands pushed through the ceiling stones and crossed the threshold, the chamber responded, not with movement, not with sound, but with a density in the air that tightened around the lungs. The intrusion disrupted nothing. Instead, the stillness asserted itself. The visitors felt it as pressure at first, then as presence. They believed they had discovered something forgotten, but the chamber had not been waiting to be found. It had been continuing its task. Light from their torches trembled along the walls, but the stone did not reflect it eagerly. Instead, it absorbed the brightness, dimming it into something quieter. The air felt heavier than the depth alone could explain. These hands, unfamiliar with the old discipline, felt the sensation immediately. The chamber was not closed in the way tombs were closed. It was active, balanced, awake in its stillness. What they touched remained unchanged by centuries. Wood had not bowed. The stone had not cracked. Fibers retained their form. What had resisted the surface world for generations did so effortlessly here. Burial had been too effective. The very act meant to erase had ensured continuity instead. This was not a discovery. It was contact between two states of time, one shaped by change, the other by stillness engineered so precisely that change could not find entry. The chamber did not welcome the intrusion. It did not reject it. It simply existed in a condition that did not account for outsiders. And those who entered understood, even before their thoughts could form the understanding, that nothing buried here had ever truly been lost. The first breath taken inside the core chamber always felt different. Air that had rested undisturbed for generations pressed into the lungs with a quiet firmness, neither cold nor warm, simply present, as though shaped by the stone itself. Those who entered felt their heartbeats slow without intention. Movement became measured, not by caution, but by the gravity of the space. The chamber did not demand reverence. It imposed stillness through the condition it maintained. The objects resting within seemed untouched by the long burial. Wood, which should have dried or cracked, held its form. Stone remained sharp at the edges. Fibers retained their weave with improbable clarity. Even metals, prone to tarnish, wore only the faintest film of time. Nothing here aged the way the surface world understood aging. Preservation had not been symbolic, it was structural. The chamber calibrated itself to resist decay, balancing pressure, darkness, and stillness until change found no place to take root. Visitors could sense this not through reasoning, but through the body. Muscles tightened slightly, adjusting to the density of the air. Sound fell close to the ear, refused by the walls that preferred quiet. Even the light they carried behaved strangely. Torch flames narrowed, burned steadier, their usual flicker suppressed, as though the chamber rejected unnecessary motion. A calm, grounding line whispered through the enclosed air. reminding the intruders that what they encountered was not dormant, it was equilibrium. The builders had shaped the chamber for a purpose that did not rely on guardians. No one was meant to return. Its systems required no tending, no ritual renewal. Once sealed, the interior governed itself. Pressure distributed through the stone in slow, even pulses. Darkness remained absolute, protecting the contents from the slightest intrusion of heat or wind. The chamber had become a world where only continuity was possible. Outside, centuries of sandstorms had swept across the desert, carving new ridges and burying old paths. Kingdoms had risen and thinned. Languages had shifted, leaving echoes where clarity once lived. Yet none of this touched the chamber. The surface world aged, but the core system did not. What had been placed here remained bound to the moment of its arrival, frozen not by magic, but by design. When the seal was finally broken, and the first faint draft of outside air slipped in, the chamber did not yield to it. The intrusion was too slight to disturb the equilibrium. Dust that had gathered over centuries continued its patient layering, responding only to gravity. Even the objects nearest the threshold retained their stillness. What little air moved did so reluctantly, as though the chamber allowed only the minimum disruption required to acknowledge the presence of outsiders. Those who entered felt the difference before they saw anything. Their steps softened, their breath shallowed. No one spoke loudly. The chamber discouraged excess. When they raised their torches, the space revealed itself slowly, not in dramatic unveiling, but as though it were allowing the intruders to see only what belonged to sight. Shadows clung to corners with intent, suggesting depths that did not rely on light to exist. And through all of this, one truth pressed itself into the awareness of those inside. The chamber had not been waiting to be opened. It had simply continued. Its stillness was not the stillness of death. It was the stillness of preservation, ongoing, unbroken, complete. The objects placed within resisted interpretation. Their arrangement remained flawless, untouched by tilting or settling. They stood where hands had set them, not out of reverence, but because the chamber refused decay. The visitors struggled to understand how such perfection had survived, knowing instinctively that the explanation lay not in what they saw, but in the condition they felt. Burial had been too effective. Concealment had created a sanctuary rather than an end. Some of those standing in the chamber would later speak of a presence, not spiritual but structural, an awareness that the space held to itself. They sensed the chamber would remain unchanged long after they departed, long after their footsteps faded from the passage above. For this place did not respond to discovery. It did not shift under attention. It acknowledged nothing beyond its own balance. Systems built to preserve do not awaken, they endure. And this one endured so perfectly that time itself hesitated at its threshold. Pressure did not arrive as a single moment. It gathered slowly, beginning far above the sealed corridors, in decisions made by those who had never walked the disciplined passages or felt the weight of the deeper chambers. New authorities turned their attention toward the old structures, not out of reverence, but out of desire to control, to repurpose, to erase what they could not command. Their intent moved downward long before their hands did. At first, only the surface stones felt the intrusion. Tools struck edges that had rested peacefully beneath sand. Dust rose in startled clouds, drifting along the disturbed air. The intruders did not understand the design. They relied on force. They pried at joints shaped for balance, not for resistance against such aggression. The stone responded not by shattering, but by absorbing the blows into its larger order. The strikes felt loud to those delivering them, yet the deeper walls barely acknowledged the disturbance. When passages were forced open, the narrow corridors reacted in the only way they understood. They swallowed the intruders' noise, dimming their voices into muffled echoes. Torches carried downward flickered against surfaces designed to discipline light, confining brightness into thin, uncertain streaks. The intruders believed this was a sign of the chamber's fragility, never realizing it was a sign of its control. Far below, the core systems remained undisturbed. Pressure traveled through stone in careful gradients, guided by construction techniques no longer remembered. The deepest chambers did not protest the intrusion. They simply continued in equilibrium, absorbing the vibrations like slow breaths taken over centuries. At the upper levels, where discipline had once shaped movement, intruders found their progress hindered not by traps or guardians, but by the structure itself. Passageways narrowed in ways that confounded large tools. Corners angled sharply, turning force back on those who applied it. Rooms widened unexpectedly, dispersing momentum. The architecture did not resist, it redirected. And in doing so, it revealed the limits of force. A calm grounding line settled over the scene, steady even in the face of intrusion. Systems built for endurance do not collapse under attention. As the intruders continued downward, their destruction grew less effective. Stones pried apart shifted against the pressure of their neighbors, rebalancing into new positions that maintained stability. Fires lit to burn away coverings sputtered in the dense air, their smoke clinging to the walls rather than rising in triumph. Heat spread unevenly, revealing the chamber's preference for coolness. What the intruders tried to disrupt returned to stillness as soon as their hands moved on. Attempts at erasure exposed more than they destroyed. Symbols, long hidden beneath surface dust, reappeared in fractured lines when outer layers of stone were chipped away. Passages that had been forgotten revealed unexpected depths when walls gave way to older corridors behind them. The intruders mistook these discoveries for victory, unaware they were uncovering proof of the system's persistence. Objects removed from their placements lost coherence immediately. Wooden pieces swelling in the sudden moisture of open air, fibers unraveling in sunlight, metals tarnishing with exposure, everything that relied on the chamber's condition faltered outside its protection. The intruders carried these damaged fragments away triumphantly, failing to see that they had captured only shadows of what the chamber preserved. Yet within the chamber, nothing essential changed. The system adapted by becoming less visible. Spaces once orderly now appeared chaotic to untrained eyes, though their internal logic remained intact. The intruders saw collapse, but the chamber saw redistribution. Stones shifted into new balances. Dust spread to conceal points of intrusion. Darkness resumed its authority, swallowing the traces of force. The deeper the intruders pushed, the clearer the chamber's nature became. Pressure could disturb surfaces, but it could not alter the condition beneath. The system had been built to withstand centuries of weight, silence, and isolation. What were a few hours of human force compared to the patience of stone? Authority changed above ground, intentions shifted, but the chambers did not recognize these new rulers. They acknowledged only the laws set into their design. The threat did not end continuity, it clarified it. Inside the core, the air remained steady, untouched by smoke or noise. The objects rested where they belonged. The equilibrium held. And the system continued, quiet, enduring, complete. As the intruders pressed deeper, their confidence grew uneven. The upper halls had yielded just enough to encourage further force, yet never enough to offer true access. With each layer broken open, they believed the chambers weakened. But what cracked under their tools were only the surfaces, thin skins of stone that concealed the deeper geometry beneath. The structure's strength did not reside in those outer layers. It lived in the alignment of weight, in the balance of pressure, in the equilibrium that no chisel could reach. They descended with torches and metal rods, each strike echoing strangely through the passages. Sound behaved differently here. Instead of carrying forward, it folded back upon itself, returning to the ear as a softened pulse. Their shouts dulled against the walls. Their footsteps lost clarity. The chamber taught restraint even to those who sought its ruin. Lower still, they found openings where none should have existed. Stones displaced by their earlier force had revealed cracks leading into older corridors, channels forgotten even by those who had built above them. These paths were narrow, carved with intention rather than error. The intruders believed they had stumbled upon secret routes, not understanding that the structure's design allowed for redistribution under pressure. What they mistook for hidden entrances was simply the system adjusting itself to remain whole. A calm grounding line drifted through the deepening dark. Endurance reshapes itself without losing its nature. In one chamber, they lit fires to drive back the shadows. Flames rose, but the air resisted, constraining the fire's breath. Smoke clung low, swirling in patterns determined by the chamber's geometry. The intruders coughed, waving their torches in frustration. They believed the room lacked ventilation. In truth, the room resisted movement that disrupted its equilibrium. Stillness pressed upon heat until the flames diminished, surrendering their brightness to the disciplined air. Elsewhere, a group attempted to dismantle a wall block by block. They pried at the seams with iron bars, loosening stone that had not shifted in centuries. Each removed block created only a shallow cavity, revealing yet another layer of stone set with equal precision. The deeper they dug, the more the structure repeated itself. No hollow revealed weakness. No void offered collapse. They believed the chambers hid something behind these walls, unaware that the walls themselves were the purpose. Frustration grew, tools struck harder, voices rose, dust filled the narrow corridors, drifting around their movements like a faint reminder of the depth that surrounded them. Yet even their struggle became part of the system's adaptation. The dust settled where light could not reach, concealing marks of intrusion almost as soon as they were made. What seemed violent to the intruders became, in the chamber's logic, another layer of time. Some objects were seized and dragged upward through the disturbed passages. Yet once exposed to the open air, they changed rapidly, warp, tarnish, fracture. Removed from the conditions that had preserved them, they surrendered to the world's natural decay. The intruders called this fragility. They did not realize it was proof. What belonged to the chamber lived only within the chamber. Outside, it became ordinary, incomplete. Still, the intruders forced deeper, convinced that persistence would yield reward. But the lower they reached, the more the system returned to its original authority. The air grew cooler. Stone pressed inward with gentler, steadier weight. Even their tools, warmed by friction, cooled quickly in the dense stillness. The chamber absorbed energy as it had been designed to do, quietly, efficiently, without offering resistance or compliance. The deepest levels did not answer to force at all. When metal struck stone here, the sound vanished instantly, swallowed so completely that the intruders exchanged uneasy glances. Light from torches dimmed along the walls, as if the stone consumed brightness the way it consumed sound. They had reached the threshold of the core. And there their efforts weakened, not because they were tired, but because the space itself diminished their intentions. Pressure from without met equilibrium from within. The intruders could not articulate why their hands slowed, why their breath grew tight, why silence pressed heavier than the weight of stone above them. Some spoke of a presence, others denied it, but all felt the same truth rising through the deep calm of the chamber. The system had not yielded. It had simply revealed that force was incapable of altering what had been designed to endure. The chambers changed function under pressure, but not nature. They adapted by becoming less visible to intrusion, more loyal to the conditions that shaped them. The threat did not end continuity. It refined it. Pressure deepened as the intruders lingered in the lowest reaches of the structure. The air, dense and measured, pressed softly against their skin, reminding them with every breath that they did not belong to this equilibrium. They carried their torches as if light alone could claim authority, but the flames thinned the deeper they reached. Here, illumination behaved like a visitor too uncertain to stay. Shadows thickened, not in menace, but in endurance, wrapping themselves around the stone in a way that suggested the chamber's true allegiance. The intruders attempted one final effort. They brought heavier tools, striking the floor with the hope of forcing a collapse, but the stone responded as it always had, not with shatter, but with redistribution. Vibrations traveled outward through a network of latent geometry, dissipating into the walls, into the ceiling, into the weight above. The chamber had been built for pressure greater than human hands could generate. What they delivered was a whisper compared to the centuries of earth bearing down upon it. Even their breath began to betray them. The dense air slowed inhalation, thickened exhalation, and turned urgency into fatigue. Sweat cooled too fast on their skin, as though the chamber absorbed warmth as efficiently as it absorbed sound. Tools grew heavy in their hands. Voices, once sharp with determination, softened, dissolving into the shadows like grains into sand. A calm grounding line settled through the chamber, unwavering beneath the intruders' growing frustration. Endurance outlasts intrusion when design favors stillness. They tried fire again, dragging torches close to surfaces they hoped would crack or reveal hidden seams, but the flames dimmed, surrendering their heat to the chamber's balance. Smoke drifted only inches before pressing downward, clinging to the floor in reluctant swirls. The intruders coughed, waved desperately at the haze, and stepped back, unnerved by a room that refused to interact with their intentions. One struck a column with his full strength. The sound did not travel. It died immediately, consumed by stone calibrated to resist both echo and tremor. Another attempted to wedge open a joint between floor slabs. The slab shifted only slightly, then settled again, aligning itself with the precision of a structure that corrected deviation rather than yielding to it. They began to understand, not with clarity, but with instinct, that nothing in this chamber responded to force in the way the surface world did. This space held to its own logic, one shaped by stillness rather than struggle. Some grew uneasy, others grew reckless. One intruder insisted they dig deeper, convinced that treasure or knowledge waited just beneath the visible layer. He struck the floor repeatedly, each blow becoming weaker as the air pressed heavier upon him. When his tools slipped and clattered onto the stone, the noise vanished instantly, swallowed before it reached the walls. It was then that a kind of realization brushed through the group, not a thought, but a feeling, carried through the silence like a faint ripple. The chamber was not resisting them. It had no need. Their presence could not alter its function. They were the only elements in the room that did not belong, and the structure made that clear without a single shift of stone. Objects placed in the chamber centuries earlier remained undisturbed, untouched by the chaos above. They did not rattle, they did not tilt, they did not acknowledge the intruders at all. Their endurance was a quiet demon. Stration that preservation outlasts disruption. The intruders gathered what they could, small items, fragments, dust smudged onto their fingers, yet even these felt different outside the chamber. Cold, weightless, depleted of whatever condition had preserved them. The deeper truth hovered at the edge of their awareness. Context was not an accessory to the system, it was the system. Remove anything from it, and its meaning, its strength, its identity dissolved. As they ascended, the chambers behind them reclaimed their stillness. Dust settled over fresh disturbances, smoothing the evidence of intrusion. Shadows resumed their familiar order. The air, once pushed aside by hurried movement, flowed back into place with patient certainty. By the time the intruders reached the surface, the chamber had already begun to erase the faint traces they left behind. Pressure from without had forced its entry, but not its victory. The system endured by absorbing the intrusion into its broader design. Stone rested again, silence deepened again, the condition remained unchanged. The chambers had not been conquered, they had been clarified. Survival began not with footsteps leaving the chamber, but with the quiet recognition carried in the bodies of those who had once passed through its disciplined spaces. The chambers did not rise and move. They did not shift through sand or seek new sanctuary. They remained where they had been carved, deep, silent, sealed beneath layers of forgotten pathways. Yet the system they embodied refused confinement. It traveled in a manner more enduring than physical relocation. It traveled through memory that did not rely on words. The first carriers of this unspoken knowledge were those who had stood nearest the core and felt the weight of its equilibrium. They did not understand the condition with clarity. They could not name the balance of air, the calibration of pressure, or the discipline of darkness, but their bodies remembered how stone guided breath into steadiness. Their steps remembered how corridors reshaped posture. Their minds remembered silence, not as absence, but as an active force. When these individuals returned to their own lands, they found themselves shaping new structures almost without intent. Stones were arranged in patterns reminiscent of the deep chambers, though no blueprint guided their hands. Doorways narrowed into familiar proportions. Inner rooms settled into darkness, arranged for stillness rather than shelter alone. Even the placement of certain objects followed an order they could not explain. The desert system lived on in these gestures, small, deliberate, instinctive. A calm grounding line settled across each new foundation. Survival did not require escape, it required translation. As more structures rose, the echo of the original discipline became clearer. Builders who had never touched the desert stone still learned from those whose bodies carried its memory. They watched how a wall was aligned not to maximize space, but to direct movement. They observed how a room's height influenced quietness. They adopted these methods not because they understood their origins, but because the spaces felt right. They fostered clarity. They encouraged calm. They were preserved. In distant regions, where forests thickened the air and mountains reshaped the horizon, the system adapted without losing itself. Stone replaced sand, wood replaced stone, clay replaced wood, yet the proportions persisted. A builder in the hills might shape a narrow corridor for reasons of practicality, never realizing that the depth of the desert chamber whispered through his work. Another might orient a room toward the least touched light, believing it was for warmth, when in truth he was echoing an ancient order of stillness. The system did not depend on imitation, it depended on resonance. Wherever a structure guided breath into steadiness, wherever darkness calibrated thought, wherever weight shaped silence, the system had relocated, not in full, not perfectly, but sufficiently to continue its purpose. Meanwhile, the original chambers remained sealed, quieter than ever. The intrusion of earlier generations had unsettled only the surface. The deeper levels had absorbed the disturbance, then resumed their equilibrium. Dust again settled into the same slow patterns, air cooled into measured density. Shadows reclaimed their old places. The chamber continued its preservation without need for guardians or memory. Yet above ground, the influence of the system grew wider. Traders built storerooms with the same logic. Monks shaped sanctuaries with proportions reminiscent of the disciplined corridors. Ports expanded using alignments that stabilized goods against heat and wind. None of these builders spoke of the desert chambers. Many no longer believed they existed, but their hands moved as though guided by a lineage carried not through text, but through practice. Relocation happened without movement of the core. The chambers remained, silent and self-contained, but their influence scattered across lands that no river could reach. The system dispersed not as fragments, but as variations, each one complete enough to sustain the condition it had inherited. The world above changed, languages shifted, maps redrew themselves, tribes rose and merged and divided. But the structures shaped by the desert system stood quietly in many places, each one holding a faint echo of the core that had never left its resting place. Survival, then, was not a matter of endurance alone. It was a matter of continuity through replication, faithful, imperfect, and utterly alive. The chambers did not travel. Their memory did. Relocation unfolded in silence, not through caravans or migrations, but through the steady repetition of gestures taught by stone. Those who built after the encounters with the core chamber began to move with an instinct they could not name. When they shaped new thresholds, they paused, not to measure, but to listen. When they lifted heavy blocks, they aligned them with the same calm precision once demanded by the deep interior. The chambers beneath the desert had impressed themselves upon their bodies in ways subtler and more enduring than memory. Structures began to appear in distant regions that felt older than the ground they stood upon. A storeroom in a coastal village carried the stillness of a subterranean hall. A mountain watchtower, narrow at its center and widened near its peak, guided breath the same way a descending corridor once had. Even small dwellings began to echo the disciplined geometry, rooms arranged to slow movement, doorways angled to soften sound, interior shadows shaped with intention, though no words explained why. The original chamber had not moved, but its discipline had. It lived now in places where desert winds never reached. A calm grounding line drifted through these distant constructions. Continuity does not require proximity, it requires fidelity. The builders themselves rarely questioned their choices. A man laying stone for a rural granary found his hands adjusting the block until it settled with a weight that felt correct. A woman shaping the entrance to a communal hall narrowed the doorway without knowing she was echoing an ancient proportion used to focus attention and quiet the body. A master mason near the northern forests carved a recessed alcove into a wall because something about the space asked for it, though no teacher had ever shown him such a design. The system had become instinct, stripped of origin yet full of effect. These new structures varied in material: timber where the desert would have used stone, clay where stone was scarce, carved earth where tools could not reach. But the logic remained. Proportions aligned with the internal rhythm of the core. Depth was respected. Orientation was chosen with care, even when the builders believed they were following nothing more than convenience or custom. In time, entire settlements began to reflect the distributed discipline. Villages arranged their homes around central voids that resembled the wide chambers of the desert sites. Market plazas formed natural narrowing points where paths converged, guiding movement as corridors once had. Temples, shrines, and gathering halls adopted the old geometry even when built for entirely different beliefs. The system had become a language without a speaker, a method without a master. Meanwhile, the sealed chambers beneath the sands grew quieter. Dust layered itself over the disturbances left by earlier intrusion. Air resumed its slow settling, compressing itself into the calibrated coolness that defined the core. Nothing within shifted, nothing aged. The system continued at its original site, even as its influence bloomed elsewhere. But while the chamber remained unchanged, the world above evolved. Travelers who entered the replicated spaces felt the same subtle restraint once imposed by the true corridors. They walked with softened steps. They spoke in quieter tones. They sensed a boundary between outer and inner spaces that required no explanation. Without knowing it, they participated in a continuation more faithful than any intentional preservation could achieve. Generations later, when the original chamber had been all but forgotten, its imprint remained alive everywhere the system had been practiced. A coastal storehouse captured the same stillness. A mountain fort held the same inward pull. A quiet sanctuary in a distant land echoed the same proportions meant to preserve, not display. No single site held the entirety of the old system anymore, yet none of them had lost it. The discipline had dispersed without fragmenting. Each location carried enough to keep the lineage intact. Relocation had not weakened the core. It had ensured the core's survival by allowing it to exist where no intrusion could destroy it, within the hands of builders who had never touched its stone, and within the forms that shaped their world long after its memory faded into calm, unnamed certainty. Relocation spread through the world not by design, but by quiet necessity. As each generation shaped its surroundings, the old discipline resurfaced in their hands, carried forward in the way breath settles inside a certain kind of room, the way footsteps slow beneath a certain kind of ceiling. They built what they needed, yet the structures they raised carried the unmistakable calm of an inheritance too subtle to name. In distant valleys, shelters carved into hillsides began to reflect the deep interior logic of the desert chambers. Their openings faced inward toward the earth rather than outward toward the open sky. Light entered in narrow bands, arranged by instinct more than planning, creating the familiar interplay of brightness and shadow that once guided movement beneath the sands. Inside these shelters, silence emerged not by decree, but by the natural settling of space into order. Children whispered without being told. Elders paused before crossing thresholds. The architecture shaped behavior just as it always had. A calm grounding line drifted through these distant echoes of the past. Relocation without movement is the most enduring form of survival. In cities rising far from the desert, new masons incorporated the old proportional rules without knowing their origin. A craftsman building a merchant hall narrowed the entrance, not for defense, but because something in the geometry felt honest, necessary. In the dim interior, the spacing of pillars mirrored the weight distribution of the ancient core. Customers walking between them felt the quiet settle into their bones, unaware they were moving through an inheritance older than the stones beneath their feet. Even in lands where wood replaced stone, the system endured. Builders raised long halls whose beams balanced the ceiling with the same calm pressure once held by the underground vaults. Heat gathered only where it was meant to. Shadows pooled in corners shaped for reflection. Doorways aligned to the rhythm of the structure rather than the convenience of the street. People felt the difference without understanding it. They stepped softer, lingered longer, spoke with unexpected steadiness. Meanwhile, the original chambers lay sealed beneath their weight of sand. They neither expanded nor diminished. The intrusion that once disturbed them had faded from relevance. Dust concealed the fractures. Silence reclaimed the passages. No guardian remained, yet none was needed. The system existed in equilibrium so complete that disturbance became part of its stillness. The chambers did not move, yet they no longer held the full burden of continuity. Their purpose had shifted, not by being altered, but by being distributed. Above, across forests, plains, and coasts, the discipline replicated itself in new traditions. A mountain village carved its council hall into the stone face of a cliff. The structure settled into the same proportions as the desert interiors. A port town shaped its granaries with doorways low enough to guide posture, a silent echo of the underground thresholds. A remote monastery arranged its meditation cells with the same narrowing and widening pattern once carved into ancient corridors. None of these places knew one another. None recognized their shared lineage, but the system recognized itself. And in this unknowing replication, the discipline achieved what the builders of the original chambers could never have predicted: a form of survival untouched by conquest, untouched by intrusion, untouched even by forgetting. What had been created for a single site now lived across landscapes that would never see its true source. The chambers beneath the desert had protected their core by refusing movement. The world above had protected it by ensuring that movement was unnecessary. The discipline lived wherever hands shaped space to preserve stillness, wherever breath softened inside a room built for quiet, wherever a structure guided its occupants without instruction. Relocation had not been forced. It had arisen naturally from the way stone teaches without speaking and the way bodies remember without knowing. The core had remained in place, yet its influence grew wider with every generation that shaped the world according to a logic older than sand, older than river, older than memory. And so the system lived on, spread across lands, carried through practice, preserved by instinct, while the chamber itself rested untouched beneath the desert, its silence deeper than ever. Its work completed the moment others began to build in its image. Generations rose and receded like slow tides, and with each passing era, the memory of the original chambers thinned. Names faded, tools changed, rituals have lost their meaning. Yet in cities far from the desert, and in villages built beside foreign rivers, certain structures bore a quiet gravity that outlived explanation. They did not stand taller than others or shine with ornaments. Their presence came from something more concealed, a continuity embedded so deeply in their proportions that even centuries of repurposing could not erase it. A merchant warehouse repainted dozens of times still carried a stillness in its central hall. A granary rebuilt after a fire maintained its old doorway's narrowing restraint. A council chamber renovated for new rulers kept its familiar silence, the kind that guided voices downward into measured tones. These spaces did not claim lineage, they simply expressed it. Through stone, through timber, through clay, the old discipline persisted without naming itself. Doors in such buildings closed with a particular heaviness, not burdensome but balanced. The weight of the wood or stone did not fully explain it. When someone pushed the door gently, it met the frame with a certainty that suggested design rather than material. Even first-time visitors noticed the sensation, though they could not articulate it. They would pause briefly, sensing a quiet return to alignment, then continue inside without understanding what had shifted within them. A calm, grounding line drifted through these unremarkable yet remarkable places. Continuity is not kept by memory, it is kept by form. In certain vaulted rooms, the silence pressed closer than the walls. Voices faded more quickly than expected, absorbed not by thickness alone, but by the chamber's geometry, an inheritance from a desert structure no one alive remembered. People spoke softly not because of reverence, but because the room encouraged it. Children running through such spaces slowed without instruction. Traders negotiating within them lowered their tones without intention. The structure guided behavior with the same quiet authority once found beneath the sands. Some noticed these effects. Sensitive individuals, builders, archivists, wanderers felt a pull when walking through these spaces. Their bodies aligned themselves instinctively, shoulders settling, breathing deepening, steps softening. They recognized without understanding that the room followed rules older than their lifetime. Others passed through unaware, feeling only a vague impression of calm or order without knowing its source. The system did not demand recognition. It only required arrangement. As cities expanded, new buildings were erected beside the old ones. Some incorporated fragments of earlier walls, some replaced entire sections. Yet the continuity held. Even when renovation altered materials, the proportions often survived. A craftsman tasked with rebuilding a roof might replicate the old angles because they felt right. A mason aligning foundation stones might preserve the original spacing simply because the pattern seemed to settle more comfortably into the earth. The discipline persisted not because anyone preserved it, but because its logic harmonized with human instinct. In time, the lineage became invisible. A tavern built atop the ruins of a former granary kept its doorway narrower than needed, guiding patrons inward with the same soft insistence. A courthouse fashioned from an abandoned storehouse inherited its silent interior without intent. A simple household cellar mirrored the depth-centered geometry of an ancient vault. No one questioned these patterns. They were mistaken for tradition or practicality or coincidence. Yet beneath every adaptation, the old system breathed. Continuity did not need to be taught. It needed only to be repeated. Shifts in purpose could not break it. A warehouse could become a sanctuary could become a market stall could collapse and return decades later as a home. The stones changed function, but their arrangement, if preserved even partially, carried the discipline forward. Long-term consequence does not announce itself, it settles. And so the world became filled with structures that held more weight in their silence than in their walls, buildings that whispered a lineage forgotten by their occupants, yet alive in the way space shaped their movements and calmed their breath. Continuity endured, hidden not in secrecy, but in plain stone. Continuity rarely revealed itself in sudden moments. It unfolded across centuries in small, almost unnoticeable gestures, an angle preserved in the rebuilding of a wall, a doorway reconstructed to the same narrowing proportions, a vault restored with curves that calmed the air. No one remembered the origin of these decisions, yet they reappeared again and again, as though the stones themselves trained each generation in the logic of their arrangement. In certain towns, structures built centuries apart felt quietly related. A flour mill on one street carried the same inner stillness as a storage hall on another. Their materials differed, timber in one, stone in the other, but the sensation of entering them was unmistakably similar. Step across the threshold, and something in the body shifted. Breaths deepened, footsteps softened, thoughts gathered inward. Visitors sometimes described these places as comfortable, though the comfort was not softness, it was alignment. Vaults in distant regions behaved alike. They held coolness with unusual consistency. Sound dissolved quickly inside them, making even arguments subdued. People assumed this was clever craftsmanship, unaware that the geometry had migrated through centuries of replicated intuition. When the builders raised these vaults, they had not followed drawings or rules. Their hands simply shaped what felt right, what settled into balance the moment it touched the earth. A calm, grounding line passed quietly through these forms, continuity sustained not by knowledge, but by repetition of what works. In bustling marketplaces where noise ruled the open air, there always seemed to be one shaded storage room where silence pooled like water. Traders believed it was luck or perhaps clever placement away from the crowd, but the truth lay hidden in the proportions, an echo of chambers originally carved for preservation, not commerce. Objects stored in such rooms lasted longer. Clothes kept their strength. Grain resisted spoilage. No one questioned why. They followed the pattern because the pattern did not fail. Homes, too, carried fragments of the old discipline. A family dwelling in a coastal village might include a narrow inner room where voices hushed naturally, a place older family members favored without explaining their preference. A house carved into a hillside might contain a stone-lined alcove whose shape fostered contemplation, though its builder had intended only storage. In time, these rooms were renamed the quiet place, the cool room, the listening corner. None realized they were living in the descendants of ancient chambers. The influence even reached into buildings meant for gathering and judgment. Courts built in distant lands echoed the same proportional relationships as their forgotten ancestors. The judges spoke in low tones because the room demanded it. Disputes softened inside spaces calibrated for stillness. The architecture shaped behavior long after the purpose of its shaping had changed. Still, most passed through unaware. They entered a bakery whose ovens were arranged to channel heat with improbable efficiency, never realizing the builder had mimicked the arrangement of vents from structures meant to preserve ritual objects. They stepped into hostels where long corridors created an unexpected sense of order, unaware these were ancestral reflections of pathways once carved deep underground. Continuity persisted not in obvious markers, but in subtleties. The weight of a closing door, the quiet that gathered in the joints between stones, the balance of coolness and shadow that seemed to breathe with the space. Meanwhile, the original chambers beneath the desert remained sealed. Their silence deepened, untouched by the centuries unfolding above. Yet their influence walked through the world in forms no intruder could dismantle. What the chambers taught through form had migrated into countless structures, diluted yet still potent, transformed yet still recognizable to anyone who had once stood within the original stillness. And though no one spoke of lineage, though no story named the source, the system persisted wherever stones were arranged in a way that guided breath, disciplined sound, and shaped the movement of those who stepped inside. Continuity had become a hidden companion, present, unnoticed, steady. It waited in plain stone, in familiar thresholds, in rooms that quieted voices and deepened thought. It moved with the world without ever announcing itself. Continuity settled into the world the way dusk settles into stone, quietly, evenly, without ceremony. Buildings that carried the old discipline did not rise above others or demand attention. They stood with the humility of ordinary structures, their significance hidden beneath layers of repainting, repurposing, and forgetfulness. Yet those who passed through them often felt a subtle shift, a sense of being held in alignment without knowing why. In a distant town, a storage hall built centuries earlier had long since been converted into a meeting place. Its walls bore murals from different eras, each layer of paint telling a story unrelated to its origins. Still, the hall maintained a silence that steadied every gathering. Disputes softened, voices found rhythm. Even heated conversations curved into calm patterns as though shaped by the architecture itself. No one questioned why the hall behaved differently from others. It simply did. Continuity lived beneath the new colors. A calm, grounding line drifted gently through such places. What endures does not hide, it embeds. Far away, in a highland monastery shaped from rough-hewn stone, novice monks practiced their readings inside a chamber whose proportions echoed a logic older than their teachings. The abbot could not explain why this room fostered deeper quiet than the others. The walls were the same thickness, the floor the same material. Yet when novices sat within its narrow entry and widening interior, their breath settled more quickly and their thoughts steadied as if guided by unseen instruction. The architecture carried a forgotten lineage, woven into stone too ancient for memory. In a coastal city, a granary once built for traders had become a warehouse for imported goods. Workers entered and remarked on the coolness that remained even in the harshest summer. The barrels stacked along the walls held their contents longer, spoiling less often than in neighboring storerooms. The owner attributed this to the building's position near the water, unaware that its interior followed the same ancient geometry that once preserved offerings beneath desert sands. Continuity had not depended on faith or ritual, it had survived through structure. Even modest homes reflected the old discipline. A family dwelling might contain a room where guests instinctively lowered their voices, where children walked more gently, where elders lingered in peaceful pause. The builders had shaped this room without tale or instruction. They followed only the sense that the proportions felt balanced. And in that balance, the system lived on. It did not demand recognition. It expressed itself through quiet, consistent results. Travelers often noticed these places without understanding them. A merchant resting in a roadside shelter might remark that he slept deeper there than anywhere else. A scholar reading by lamplight inside a narrow chamber might find clarity more readily. A weary caravan might reorganize its goods with greater efficiency inside a warehouse built by hands who never learned the system consciously. These experiences were dismissed as coincidence, comfort, or luck. But continuity was neither coincidence nor chance. It was practice becoming instinct, instinct becoming tradition, tradition becoming architecture. Generations continued to reshape these buildings. Walls were replaced, roofs repaired, floors reinforced, tools changed and materials shifted with the age. Yet the proportions, the quiet heart of the structure persisted. Even builders who sought to modernize found themselves preserving the old logic unconsciously. When a wall felt wrong, they adjusted it. When a room felt too open, they narrowed it. When an entry resisted alignment, they remembered it with intuition shaped by unknown inheritance. The original chambers beneath the desert remained unmoved by these changes. They neither gained nor lost from the continuity above. Yet in a way deeper than preservation, they had succeeded. Their discipline had escaped without moving. Their geometry had traveled without shifting a single stone. Their purpose, once held in a few sealed rooms, had been distributed across continents through the simple transmission of form. Continuity hid in plain stone. It lingered in the weight of a closing door, in the hush inside a vaulted room, in the stillness that pressed gently upon a visitor's breath. It shaped behavior without command, preserved memory without narrative, and endured without being named. Long-term consequences had settled across the world, quiet as dust, steady as shadow. And though no one recognized its origin, the system still waited, alive in every structure that guided breath into calm, held silence with purpose, and aligned the body without words. Stone continued to do what it had always been shaped to do. It was held, it is preserved, it waited. The buried chambers beneath the desert, unchanged by centuries, rested in a silence so complete that even memory seemed to slow in its presence. Above them, the dunes shifted in long, patient breaths, covering, uncovering, then covering again the faint traces of thresholds once known only to those who had shaped them. Nothing declared itself finished. Nothing declared itself begun. The system moved in a cycle, without edge or center. The desert sun rose and fell in an ancient rhythm, casting long shadows across stones that refused to surrender their alignment. Wind carved the surface with quiet insistence, but the structures beneath did not bend to its will. Their purpose remained intact, not through force, but through equilibrium. What had been shaped to endure did so naturally, without strain. Even in stillness, the chambers held a kind of motion, not movement through space, but continuity through time. Hands in distant lands are still measured, aligned, and sealed according to instincts carried from forgotten origins. Builders paused before lifting a stone, sensing a familiar weight in its balance. Carpenters narrowed openings with the same quiet precision once used to shape subterranean passages. Even those who had never seen the desert, who had never touched the cool interior of the ancient chambers, found themselves echoing their geometry. The system extended itself without effort. It simply continued, woven into the practices of those who shaped the world. A calm grounding line drifted across this unnamed inheritance. Endurance does not end, it settles deeper. In cities far from the river, structures rose with the same quiet authority as the original chambers. Doorways closed with a familiar heaviness. Vaults maintained their silence without instruction. Rooms designed for reflection held the same inward pull as the older sanctuaries. People walked through these places unaware of their lineage, feeling only the subtle discipline that guided their breath and softened their footsteps. Yet nothing here was finished. Each new building carried only a portion of the old system, adapted through generations of instinct and practice. The original chambers did not require recognition to remain complete, nor did the newer structures require their source to function. Continuity had left the desert long ago. It lived now in countless places where walls pressed inward with intentional calm, where shadows pooled in rooms shaped to quiet the mind, where thresholds disciplined movement without command. Above the ancient site, travelers crossed the dunes by chance, leaving footprints that vanished within hours. They sensed nothing of the sealed chambers beneath their feet. Their steps touched only the shifting surface, unaware that beneath the sand lay a geometry so precise that centuries of pressure had not altered its balance. The desert, indifferent to memory, continued its slow, unbroken cycles. Yet its silence carried the weight of something unfinished, something still working, still enduring, still holding to its original purpose. Within the deep interior, dust continued its slow descent. Each grain followed the same ancient logic, falling, settling, becoming part of the stillness that preserved everything within. The objects remained untouched. The air retained its steady density. The chamber did not age. It accumulated time like a deep well gathers water, quietly, invisibly, without spilling a single moment. What could not be hidden was not a relic or artifact. It was the endurance itself, the way stillness resisted erasure, the way design shaped behavior long after memory failed, the way preservation continued without guardians, rituals, or stories. The system held not because someone protected it, but because it had been shaped correctly from the beginning. Its unfinished nature was its strength. A system without conclusion could not collapse, it could only continue. And so stone waited, not for discovery, not for restoration, but simply because waiting had been written into its form. The chambers below and the structures above belonged to the same unfolding continuity, each new generation contributing without knowing, each stone placed in alignment with a pattern that did not require explanation. The desert remained quiet, the chambers remained whole, the system remained incomplete only in the sense that it would never be finished. Endurance does not conclude, it deepens. And in that deepening, the old design lived on. The desert night moved slowly across the dunes, drawing long stretches of quiet over the buried chambers. Above, the wind traced subtle arcs through the sand, covering and uncovering edges of stone, as though testing whether the world was still remembered. It did not. Yet the chambers did not require remembrance. They remained in their equilibrium, holding steady beneath the shifting weight, continuing a task with no beginning and no end. Inside, the air rested against the walls with the same patient density it had carried for generations. The objects preserved within did not change. They did not fade or fracture. They existed in a state shaped by design rather than time, untouched by the cycles above. Light had not entered these rooms in centuries, yet darkness did not feel empty here. It felt full, full of continuity, full of purpose withheld but not lost. The system did not age, it accumulated. Builders in distant places continued shaping new structures without knowing whose echo they carried. A craftsman in a mountain village might lift a stone and feel an instinct to adjust its angle, not because he had been taught, but because the stone itself suggested alignment. A mason in a coastal town might narrow a doorway by a hand's breadth, unaware that the proportion mirrored a chamber buried beneath the sands of an ancient river. A carpenter far to the north might carve a recess into a wall, thinking it practical, not realizing he was repeating a gesture made thousands of years earlier in a forgotten corridor. A calm grounding line rested in these repetitions. What remains unfinished continues through those who shape without knowing. Even the most ordinary buildings held fragments of this lineage. A barn designed to store grain kept its central aisle narrower than comfort required, guiding movement the same way old passages once had. A cellar reinforced against seasonal floods bow. Geometric precision, foreign to the region yet familiar to the deeper system. Children played in rooms that quietly disciplined their footsteps. Elders rested in spaces that eased their breathing. Life unfolded within these structures, unaware of the inheritance shaping it. Across vast distances, continuity appeared in places with no connection except the logic embedded in their form. A quiet sanctuary in the highlands shared the same inward pull as a marketplace storeroom near the sea. A judicial hall in a bustling capital echoed the stillness of a hidden shrine in a remote village. None of these structures had been modeled after the chambers. None carried their names, yet all belonged to the same unfolding, the same unfinished system. Meanwhile, the original chambers beneath the desert remained sealed, their silence undisturbed. No new hands pried at their stones. No authorities sought to claim or dismantle them. They were forgotten, and in forgetting they were protected. Dust layered itself over the last traces of intrusion until even the memory of disturbance dissolved. The equilibrium returned so completely that it seemed as though nothing had ever entered, nothing had ever tried to force its way inside. The system did not require attention to maintain itself. It required only stillness. And in the deep interior, stillness prevailed. If the chambers could think, They would not recognize the structures built in their likeness across distant lands. Yet those structures recognized them, not consciously, but through the logic they inherited. What was unfinished in the desert found completion through repetition elsewhere. What had been sealed below found expression above. Endurance had escaped the boundaries of stone and traveled into the hands of builders, into the instincts of generations, into the quiet mathematics of space. Burial had never stopped the system, it had strengthened it. Stillness had not immobilized it, it had dispersed. The system had no final state because it had never been meant to conclude. Its purpose was continuation, not as a story, not as a relic, but as a condition that shaped the world wherever stone, wood, or clay aligned in certain proportions. Even now, travelers crossing the desert at dusk sensed nothing beneath their feet. Their camels walked across dunes softened by evening light. Sand shifted beneath the hoof and foot. But far below, in sealed chambers untouched by their journey, the system continued its unbroken stillness, holding and preserving without witness. Nothing was finished. Everything remained in motion through the quiet work of endurance. What remained unfinished slipped quietly into the world, not as legacy, not as memory, but as a condition embedded so deeply into form that even ruin could not silence it. Buildings collapsed, were rebuilt, collapsed again, yet certain proportions returned regardless of who shaped the new walls. A corridor narrowed without instruction. A chamber expanded at its center. A doorway carried the same familiar weight when closed. These gestures were not preservation, they were re-emergence, rising through instinct rather than knowledge. In regions where stone was scarce, builders worked with timber or packed earth, yet the old geometry still appeared. A cottage tucked against a forest ridge held a single room whose stillness echoed the far chambers beneath the desert. A shrine in a snowbound valley carried an inward hush so profound that visitors removed their boots without being told. Even a humble shelter built by traveling herders bore the subtle discipline of space, arranged to quiet the air around it. Continuity had traveled without map or memory. It emerged wherever human hands shaped matter with attention. A calm grounding line lay beneath all of these scattered forms. What endures does so by refusing finality. People living within these structures felt the effects without naming them. A mother in a mountain dwelling soothed her child in a small inner room whose silence calmed breath as naturally as the wind quieted at dusk. Merchants storing grain in a seaside warehouse found their goods lasted longer in one particular corner, a corner whose shape descended from a geometry lost to time. Monks in distant temples sought solitude in narrow cells built according to a pattern no scripture described, but every novice felt. Each of these places whispered a continuity too subtle for language, too persistent for forgetting. Meanwhile, the original chambers rested in their depths, sealed beneath centuries of drifting sand. They neither communicated nor commanded. Their influence did not radiate outward like a force. It seeped upward slowly, carried through subtle gestures imprinted on those who once stood inside. Their stillness had become a blueprint, not copied exactly, but translated through bodies, through hands, through the quiet recognition of what felt right when shaping a space. Above, the desert shifted its shape, as it always has. Dunes collapsed and reformed, rock faces eroded, ancient paths vanished overnight beneath wind-driven sand, yet the thresholds of buried chambers remained intact beneath this constant rearrangement. The earth accepted their endurance without protest. Their purpose required no renewal. They were complete in their incompleteness. Elsewhere, empires rose and dissolved. Roads connected distant territories. Scripts evolved, religions shaped new rituals, rulers issued new laws. None of this altered the old discipline. It waited in plain sight, in the way a storage cellar was sealed, in the height of a lectern in a remote monastery, in the depth of a well built by villagers who had never seen a desert. Some travelers sensed it. They walked into a room and felt the shift, breath slowing, thoughts settling, sound dimming. They looked around, expecting some decoration or design to explain the sensation, but found only walls worn by time and use. They left puzzled, unaware they had stepped into an echo of a chamber buried far from their homeland. Others passed through these spaces without noticing at all, yet they moved differently while inside, more deliberate, more attentive. The architecture did not need recognition to operate. Its influence was embedded, not announced. Long-term consequences had taken the form of a quiet thread woven through generations of construction, not a lineage of masters and apprentices, nor a doctrine preserved in scrolls, but an instinct that reappeared whenever human hands sought to shape a space that held meaning. The system remained unfinished precisely because it could never be complete. Each new structure extended it. Each adaptation strengthened it. Each partial echo carried the full weight of its purpose. Deep below, the original chambers continued to do only what they were shaped to do. They held, they were preserved, they waited. Their endurance did not manifest in grandeur or in revelation. It appeared in small, unremarkable rooms across distant lands, in doorways that closed with familiar weight, in vaults that quieted the world without effort. What could not be hidden was not a secret. It was a way of enduring. And endurance, by its nature, has no end.